Well, hello, everyone. And this is our Gala New Year's, and I couldn't start with a better guest speaker meeting of the THSFW or THSFZ. We're between names. And we are so happy to be meeting here on January the 4th in the new year of 2025 with one of our best friends of science fiction and most luminous stars, Marleen Barr. She doesn't want me to deal in hyperbole, so I won't go on too long with all her amazing achievements, but just that you know, how can I put this? She sent science fiction into the orbit of the MLA, and they didn't know if they were ready for her sending science fiction into that orbit. And for those who don't know, the MLA is the Modern Language Association. All those things you had to learn in high school, they set the standards for your citing of things. It's a big, important group in language studies, and Marleen just about turned it on its end. So I will do a couple more utility slides here about good behavior in meetings. And after that, we will, if I can get my forwarding, if I can't, I'll just say it verbally and get out of the share screen. First of all, and what I said before about muting your sound when we have a speaker is very important because people have people coming in and saying things. And also make yourself invisible. So at the bottom of your screens, you see the mute button and the stop video button. What you can do if a question occurs to you while Marleen is speaking, just write it in chat. And there is a chat button on most of your screens. So at this point, I'm going to stop share. And I'm going to turn it over to Marleen to do this New Year's, do this New Year proud, Marleen. Let us hear about you.
Well, thank you very much. And I wish everyone a happy New Year. And to tell you what I am, just very simply, I could say it in a sentence. I'm a feminist science fiction scholar, and I was the first English professor to have feminist science fiction as my main field, and even science fiction, generic science fiction that's not specifically feminist, as my main field, because at my time, all of the science fiction scholars did not name science fiction as their first field. They said that they were like medievalists or Victorian scholars or something like that. And they thought, and science fiction was an afterthought to them, because being a science fiction scholar, when I started, it was very hard because all of the older male English professors and all the people older than me were male. When I was a graduate student, I had no women on my committee. I studied at Buffalo. I got my PhD at SUNY Buffalo, and I had the privilege of studying with Leslie Fiedler. And I got my master's degree at the University of Michigan, and I studied with a science fiction scholar named Eric S. Rapkin. And I don't know, I was like 21 years old, and I was living on the North Campus of the University of Michigan, and I took the Michigan bus down to the English department, and I walked in and I said, hello, Eric Rapkin. When I grow up, I want to be a science fiction scholar just like you. And can I please be your grader? And he looked at me and he said, okay, Marleen Barr, you can be my grader. And I know Eric that was probably 1975. And I know Eric since then, and this is very sad, but it's chronologically true. He's the only one of my former professors who is still alive, because he's 7 or 8 years older than me, and neither of us are dead yet. And it was great to be a science fiction scholar and to have Eric interact with me for all of these years. And this is a personal thing, but when I was at the University of Michigan, we went to the Science Fiction Research Association together, and the meeting was in Chicago, and we took the train from Ann Arbor to Chicago. And we were on the train when I was like 22 and he was like 29, and he said, Marleen, do you think that I should have another child? He had a son then named David. And I took a moment and I paused and I go, yeah, Eric, that's a very good idea. You should have another child. So he goes, okay, when we get home from the conference, I will go and I will tell my wife. So the end of the story is that Eric did have another child, and her name is Rachel, and she now has two other children. And I think that these people exist because of me, because I said to myself, what would I have done if I told Eric that that he should not have another child? There would be no Rachel. And I think Rachel knows this, because I don't know, if someone owes me something, I kind of tell them. Um, so Gloria, can I see you? Because it's kind of like I'm talking to myself and I don't have anyone to look at. Okay, that makes me feel better. I could talk better if there's
I will also interrupt. Remember, we had a few talking points, so if you don't wend into them on your own, or just have me remind you who else you're going to do your anecdotes on, because I have the notes here.
okay. So Eric, he was very influential to me, and his name is Eric S. Rapkin. And when I started, I called myself Marleen Barr, but then I just my middle name is Sandra, and I said, well, if he's an S, I'm going to be an S too. So then I signed myself Marleen S. Barr for the whole rest of my life, and I told Eric that was because of him. And at Buffalo, I worked with Leslie Fiedler, and also on my committee was a famous scholar named Norman N. Holland, and I was much closer to Norm than to Leslie, but I was a little close to Leslie. And in the early 2000s, I went back to Buffalo, and I wanted to go into the English department. I wanted to see Leslie, and I felt like this pain in my jaw, and I said, oh my God, there's something wrong. Um, and what happened was I had a tooth infection. And if you don't cure a tooth infection, it could go up to your brain and you could die. So I was in the dentist's office, and he told me that if I don't get medical help, I could be dead. And I said, what? I can't deal with this. I must go and I must see Leslie Fiedler. I have to do this. And he said, well, I have to treat you first. So he did treat me and I didn't die. And I ran into the English department and I go, Leslie, it's me. And he goes, oh, Marleen, how are you? And I go, Leslie, I was going to die, but I made sure that I was able to see you. And he goes, oh, Marleen, it's always good to see you. And I'm happy to see you. And I don't know, Leslie's reference for me, I'll never forget it. He said that I would do my work under any circumstances, and in my life, this proved to be true. And I ran in there and I said, Leslie, I had a tooth infection and I was going to die, and I'm so happy that I got to see you. And he said he was happy too, and he was smoking his famous cigar. And he always talked about how Jewish he was, and I was always intrigued that he went and taught at the University of Montana, and I never knew what a Jewish person was doing in Montana. And early in my career, I went and I taught at a Southern State University, and there were cows at the Southern State University. And one day I was like walking at the back of the campus where the farm animals were, and the cows were in a herd and they stampeded, and I had to hide behind a tree. And I said, well, no New York Jew should be at a place where cows are stampeding and I had to hide behind a tree. And I said, this is not the place for me. And Norm Holland wrote me a reference, which I also never forgot. And he said, this lovely young woman from Queens has learned to live with cows. But the fact is, I never learned to live with cows. So I came home to New York, and I was glad that I did, because I wasn't meant to be there.
I have a question. I have on my list, it says, you know, the world famous. First, we better contextualize him, because actually he's not world famous, believe it or not. People outside science fiction don't know Harlan Ellison. So before you launch into your anecdotes, could you remind them all of, who he was?
Okay. Harlan Ellison, I think one of his greatest achievements was that he wrote Dangerous Visions, and there were several Dangerous Vision volumes, and he was ahead of his time, because science fiction is replete with dangerous visions, and I'm glad that he was the one who coined that term. And he was very, very brilliant and very, very outspoken, and I guess like very caustic, and he didn't adhere to conventions, like polite social conventions. And he was in one of my edited volumes. And modesty aside, when I edit a volume, I'm exceedingly good to work with. And he called me up, and I don't remember the contents, but in the phone call, he said, Marleen, F you. And, and like professors, they're like genteel, and they do not, no matter what, one professor, or I could not imagine that someone got on the phone with me and for no reason said F you, and then he hung up. And I called him back and I said, I don't care who you are. You do not speak to me that way, and I demand an apology. And I have to say, I don't remember if he apologized or not, but I'm glad that I stood up for myself. And I don't remember, somehow he got on the phone with my mother, Rosie. And at the end of Woody Allen's New York Stories, there's a bleach blonde head, and it's a Jewish mother, and it's floating all over New York. Well, that Woody Allen image of the Jewish mother had nothing up on my mother. Rosie had the biggest yelling mouth in the universe. Nobody could yell louder than Rosie. She could win the Olympic yelling contest. And I walked into the room, and my mother was on the phone screaming. And I said, who are you talking to? And she said, Harlan Ellison. I don't know what Harlan Ellison is or who he is, but I don't like him, and he's very impolite. So I had to listen to my mother and Harlan screaming at each other. And these were the two biggest screamers on the planet. And I don't know who, I think Rosie won the battle, and Harlan met his match in Rosie. And I guess that was my revenge, that Harlan, when he said F you to me, he had to be on the phone with Rosie. And she did me proud, because nobody could out yell Rosie, and I'm sure that Harlan did not.
Well, I have one little anecdote. I also had a run-in with Harlan over some caustic things he said about Kurt Vonnegut's book, Breakfast of Champions, that was reviewed. He reviewed it in F&SF Fantasy and Science Fiction magazine. And he said something that was very cruel, I thought, because that the suicide of his mother, of Vonnegut's mother, was touched on in this fiction, Breakfast of Champions. And Harlan, I don't remember what he said, but I said, this kind of personal ad hominem thing that you're doing. And I think there was a little envy there. At that time, Vonnegut was much more a household name. And so he came back. He was very angry. I didn't do it by phone, but he came back to me in a postcard, which I wish I still had. And he said, you, Gloria McMillan, writing from Tucson, Arizona, the intellectual center of the universe, of course, know better than I do. And he went on from there, And I, I was just in my 20s and a grad student, and I thought, oh, this is really scary stuff. And I was a pen pal with Isaac Asimov, who was also a very big writer and much more mellow than Harlan. And I said, he really was blah, 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 blah. And Asimov said, oh, I know Harlan, his bark is worse than his bite, and blah, blah, blah. So that was an interesting trio of Asimov, Harlan, and me. But I know Harlan had many, many feuds, and that was part of his charm for a lot of people, was that he had that same Don Rickles kind of act. And one of them was with Robert Scholes, the very prominent, you probably have heard of him. He was a prominent SF critic and used to write in the New Yorker and place, I don't know where, but big magazines. And he referred, Harlan being he referred to Robert Scholes as an academic literary leech. So that was his opinion of all of us who write critically about science fiction. And I think, it is very good to have someone who isn't in awe of everyone. So he was a caustic voice and a very funny one, and I remember him as well. So
Well,
go,
I know Bob Scholes, because Bob was the teacher of Eric Rapkin, and
uh-huh.
academics go in families, and I always thought that I was part of I was a female scion of the Bob Scholes, Eric Rapkin family, and I'm proud of that. And Bob was a gentleman, and I I don't care how famous you are, but I don't think that somebody should use profanity during a professional call about an article. I really don't think that's right. And for Harlan calling Scholes and people of our ilk who are professors, calling them leeches, I was sort of always aware of the schism between science fiction writers and science fiction scholars. And my answer to that is the society really doesn't care what we do anyway. And it's just like a different discourse practice. And I don't think that writers should think that scholars call them names um like like leeches. The scholars are in the classroom teaching people, and they're doing a wonderful job. And just because you have a different discourse practice, there should not be a schism. There's 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 room for both types of discourse. And most English professors, well, English professors do not write fiction. I can think of like people that I could count on my two hands who wrote fiction. And I did a very strange thing for an English professor. I decided, well, um, there was a famous literary critic named Darko Suvin, and I knew Darko, and I told him that I wanted to write a novel, and he had an Eastern European an Eastern European accent, and in his European accent, he said, "Marleen, I don't want to hear that you want to write a novel. Shut up and write the goddamn novel." I guess that was profanity too, but okay, I'll forgive Darko. And because of Suvin, I sat down and I wrote the goddamn novel, and I saw that I was able to do this. And the other the other day, well, the other day, like a week ago, I gave a keynote talk at a science fiction conference in New York City, an academic conference. And in my keynote talk, I gave an academic paper, and then I read a story. And when I finished doing it, I realized that I am one of the only English professors who is an academic critic who could write a story that's okay enough that that I can read it in public. And it's two different voices to be a critic, and to be a fiction writer. And I feel sort of bilingual. Like, am I going into fiction mode writing voice now, or am I going into scholarship? And I think my most important book is called Feminist Fabulation, Space, Postmodern Fiction. And one of the blurbers said that my criticism, my scholarship sounds like fiction. And when the book came out, I didn't realize that I could write fiction, but I do cross voices in that some of my fiction has scholarship in it that I start with quotes, and none of the editors know how to format my quotes because they never saw science fiction stories that start with quotations, and they always have problems of how do they format this on the page. And in my criticism, I also use fiction. And when I edited the first science fiction issue of Publications of the Modern Language Association, PMLA, in my introduction, I talked about a feminist giant talking squid. And like that is my contribution to my life's work, to put a feminist giant talking squid in the pages of PMLA. I cannot tell you what that is like. And I was I was at a conference.
I break in and say this was revolutionary. I mean, I wouldn't interrupt a speaker, but that was so revolutionary. Everyone has been condescended to in many of your classes or among your colleagues. Oh, you science fiction. I don't read science fiction. And to have that, your voice, and you put in a character, it was actually drama, with characterization. And they must have flipped. It must have sent them to another planet, some of these really stuffy ones. Go ahead.
Well, well, I was at a conference at Fordham University Lincoln Center, and I was just walking around the conference, and there was a group of women graduate students, and one of the graduate students pointed at me and said, "That's her. That's the woman who put the feminist giant talking squid in PMLA." And the women graduate students said, "No, that's really her." And the one who pointed at me said, "Yes, that's her." And like 6 women graduate students followed me into the bathroom because they wanted to see who is this person who put the feminist giant talking squid in PMLA. They couldn't believe it. And I don't know how the graduate student who first pointed me out recognized me, but that's something that I'll never forget, the women graduate students following me into the bathroom. And I was really scared to do the first science fiction issue of PMLA. And I called in a brilliant colleague, Carl Friedman, to co-edit it with me because I didn't want to take the responsibility and do it all by myself. So I was very glad that I had Carl to be the co-editor. He's a great academic tactician, and that's how scared I was that I had to call in. I had to, like on the quiz show, I had to call in a friend to give me a lifeline. And that issue, the person who was the editor of PMLA was very open to the issue of having the issue, and that's why I got to do it. But the editorial board was really beside themselves, and what they did was they limited the number of articles that I could put in the issue. And although I will never be thin in my entire life, that issue of PMLA was the thinnest one that ever existed. That's what they did.
I figured there would be a lot of blowback that would be behind the scenes, and this is our one chance to know it. For people that are scientists or that read other professional, you have to realize the importance of this magazine. This is the marching orders of English professors from Harvard on down. They use this as their Bible, this journal. So, this was big stuff. It's hard to even give an accurate image of the importance. It would be like, for New York intellectuals like New Yorkers that are in the outer community, the public, it's that important. But this is within the field of English, and it went out not only all over the US, but all over the world. Other schools in England and in other countries, that they all subscribe to the PMLA because that's the journal of this most important. And it was the big wall. It was like, some wall, the Great Wall of China, that we in science fiction couldn't get over. And of course, many in science fiction, you have to admit, Marleen, they don't want it. They would say, keep science fiction in the gutter where it belongs. You've probably heard that expression. But a lot of us didn't want to be condescended to every time we mentioned what we were in our great love of science fiction, because we knew they didn't understand it. They only read a couple bad things and then said it, right?
Well, PMLA is the flagship journal. It's the most prestigious literary criticism journal in the United States of America. And I am grateful for the person who was the editor at that time who enabled me to do it. And if it came out thin, okay, it's thin, but at least it exists. So this is like I'm this age and I've done my life, and I'm not going to cure cancer or something, but my achievement in life is I put the feminist giant talking squid in PMLA, and that's it.
So what year, do you remember about what year that was, Marleen?
Probably 2004.
See, it was that late. We'd been doing good scholarship and everything since, oh gosh, the 60s, because I had a class in science fiction, and there's literature out there, real scholars like Leslie Fiedler and people doing things in science fiction. But those guys in the MLA, those guys wouldn't hear of it. It did, you know, it was total like a sound barrier. You couldn't get it into the really big places that counted. And so what you did was amazing.
Well, the editor at the time was a woman, and she's a wonderful person. So I'm glad that she gave me the opportunity. But my greatest, my most memorable and joyful recollection of being a scholar is in the science fiction field itself. And that was in 1997 when I won the Science Fiction Research Association Lifetime Achievement Award in scholarship. That that was I have never done anything that can equal that. To It's like the Academy Award for science fiction scholars. And the SFRA meeting when I won it was on the Queen Mary boat in California. And you're not allowed, there's a tradition that you're not allowed to tell people who the winner of the award is until the ceremony. And I have a big mouth and I'm not good at keeping secrets. And I had to spend like 3 days at the conference running around the Queen Mary ship, not being able to tell anyone that I won the Pilgrim Award. It was called the Pilgrim Award. Then to me, I won the Pilgrim Award, but they changed the name. They changed the name since then. And when at the ceremony, I was there, and at the end of it, I my best friend at the time she came to be with me, and everybody cleared out of the Queen Mary dining room, and I started to cry. And she said, "Marleen, what's the matter?" And I said, "I'm 47 years old, and I have to live the rest of my life, and this is the most wonderful thing that has ever happened to me. And what do I do for the rest of my life?" Well, something good did happen again, that a wonderful Japanese scholar invited me to Japan. And and at the conference banquet, there was like an entire hotel room filled with sushi. And it was like my dream of all you could eat sushi. And I was sitting there eating all the sushi I possibly could. And I said, okay, this is almost as good as winning the Science Fiction Research Association Lifetime Achievement Award.
Well, you have some really colorful stories on your, you know, academics are thought to be dry and boring, but your stories kind of bring it to life. I hope everyone agrees with that. And I have an intersection with you. For 40 years, I was a pen pal with Isaac Asimov. And he was very much a mentor to many, many poor unknown people. It isn't well known about him, but he gave his time, taking time to encourage people that, you know, they were either low income students or they were, let's just say, struggling. Okay. And so he kept it up. And even after I'd gotten on a plateau and wasn't struggling, he kept occasionally sending me cards. And I was amazed when you said that you had gone to his wife. Was she a widow then, to interview
Yes,
her?
Isaac Asimov was no longer with us. Uh, like Isaac Asimov's wife, Janet Jepson. This is the first and only published interview that I have ever done in my life. I did an interview with her, and she invited me to her apartment where she lived with Isaac Asimov. It's on the Upper West Side near Lincoln Center in a very tall, a tall apartment building. And I walked into the apartment and I was like thrilled to be in the apartment where Isaac Asimov lived. And she took me into Isaac Asimov's bedroom and she said, "This is Isaac Asimov's typewriter." And I kind of felt like I was seeing the bridge chair in Star Trek. I said, "Oh my God, Isaac Asimov's typewriter." And I went and I touched it and I tried to type on it because maybe, I don't know, it would serve me well. And I sat in her apartment at her dining room table talking to her about Isaac Asimov, and she served me milk and cookies. I remember the milk and cookies. I don't remember the conversation, but I remember the milk
Well,
and cookies. And she was really very, very nice.
I also know that she wrote a memoir. I don't know what year it came out, about living with fame like that. There is a memoir by Janet Jepson. I don't know if you're aware of it.
No, I didn't know that.
It's about picking up the pieces from being married to a very famous person And that's kind of a niche, within widowhood, someone who was with someone kind of overshadowed, maybe, and she never complained of it, but she's bound to be overshadowed by Isaac. And then once he's gone, and being a feminist, you understand this too. That's chapter 2. What is chapter 2 for someone who, is she going to just go around, giving talks about the great man, or is there any Janet that will now surface? And that's an interesting, I haven't read her memoir, but I hope I can.
Well, I don't remember the conversation, but I did not discuss with her I didn't discuss the death of Isaac Asimov with her. And she wasn't upset or sad or anything. She was very cordial, and she didn't seem to be grieving. She was very nice.
Well, she is what, I don't know, is she still living? Do you know?
No, I don't think she's living.
She is or was a psychiatrist. So psychiatrists often do not show whatever it is, that's going on. They know how to be in a professional mode. But I recommend it. I'll try to find it maybe during the meeting, and it's in Amazon. I know a lot of people don't buy books from Amazon, but just look up Janet Jepson, and I will do that. When you continue to go on in your wonderful reminiscences about, there's another person who may need scaffolding, Marleen, and that's James Gunn or Jim Gunn. And do you want me to do it, or maybe you're better to, because people don't all know his name, and I'll try to find that book reference while you do that.
Okay. Jim Gunn was a science fiction grandmaster, and that is the biggest honor for science fiction writers. And I worked with him. I edited an anthology with him, and I was the first woman to ever work with Jim Gunn. And this man was the only perfect person that I have ever met. I think he was the antithesis of Harlan Ellison. He was kind, he was good, he was a gentleman. I worked with him very closely for over a year. There is absolutely no fault that I could find with him. He was brilliant. He knew everything. To praise him chronologically, he was of the World War II generation. He would be the age of someone who was my parent. And when I edit, I always hold my own, but I'm tripping here a little because I was so in awe of him that I still, even though he's not alive, I cannot call him Jim. When I talked about him to like my family, I would say, oh, Gunn said this and Gunn did that. I could only call him Gunn. And when I first met him, I was afraid of him. I remember sitting there and he was dressed perfectly, and I had to talk after him. And I remember that he was wearing the most gorgeous socks that I've ever seen a man wearing. And I looked at his socks and I said, he's perfect. How can I talk after someone who has such perfect socks? And again, he was a Kansan wasp, and he was the antithesis of a New York Jewish feminist. And when he worked with me, nobody could believe that he was working with a New York Jewish feminist, and he would choose to do that. It was like the odd couple, and it was like the odd couple, but we got along great. And this is how broad-minded he was, that he could work with someone like me. And the story of why he trusted me is he invited me to a conference at the University of Kansas. And he said, you must promise me that you will be here for this conference at 3:30 and not a minute later. And I said, Jim, I promise you I will be there. I will be there at 3:30. But I was in Europe, and I specifically flew home so that I could be in Kansas. And the plane took off from Holland, and they said, there's a suitcase problem and we have to fly the plane back. And I said, this is ridiculous. They don't fly the plane back for a suitcase problem. And the end of the story was that there was a bomb scare. And I realized that, and I was sitting on the plane. It landed back in Holland, and there were people in hazmat suits, and they came and they said, "Get it, get it, get it." And they were talking about the bomb. So I knew there was a bomb, and I get off the plane and I go to the plane desk and I go, "I must talk to someone in Kansas. I must. And it's an emergency." So they go, "What's wrong?" I go, "I'm going to be late for Jim Gunn's conference." So they put me on the phone and I start screaming to the secretary of the University of Kansas English department, "There was a bomb scare. I have to be late. I can't get there. I have to go on another plane. Tell Gunn." And I called up my father in New York and I said, "You got to get my paper to Kansas. You just have to." So my father said, "Okay." And he got the paper to Kansas, and Gunn knew that I was flying across the world to be there on time. And I got to LaGuardia Airport. I got the plane to Kansas. I landed in Kansas, which I didn't know where it was because it was Kansas and it wasn't New York. And they gave me the paper at the airport that my father had sent. And I somehow get transportation to the campus. It was like 90 degrees in the summer, and the University of Kansas is the most spread out place that you could ever imagine. It's not like the campus is in one building like the CUNY Graduate Center. And I run into the bathroom and I change my clothes, and I get there like at 3 o'clock, and I just like walk in, and Gunn looks at me and he says to the conference, "Marleen is here on time." And that's why he trusted me, because I kept my word. And Gunn said that editing a book is like a marriage. And he was in his late 80s when he worked with me. And he said, "I would not work with anyone, Marleen. This is like a marriage." And editing with Gunn and being the first and only woman that he ever worked with professionally is also a highlight of my career. It's something that I cherish, that I had the opportunity to work closely with him.
Yeah, it's quite a credential. As I say, the summer after my husband died, I took a road trip with a woman friend, and one of the stops was to Jim Gunn and that campus. What you say is right. And we went there in July, and it was 105 and 110% humidity. It was unbelievable, like another planet. But he was so, as you say, gracious. And if you had the opportunity to work with him, you were working with the tops and he was working with the tops. So between the two of you, and also, what's his name? Clarison. What was his first name?
Thomas Clarison.
Thomas Clarison. And didn't he found extrapolation? Did you ever meet him?
I have a Thomas Clarison story. And this is when I was an undergraduate, I knew that I wanted to be a science fiction scholar. So I must have been like a sophomore or something. And I wrote an essay, and I tried to hide the fact that I was a sophomore because I knew you had to be a professor to publish something in the academic journal Extrapolation. So I sent my article to Thomas Clarison, and I still could see it. He wrote me a response that was on half a piece of paper with the letterhead, and he said, "Dear Marleen Barr, this paper is not yet ready for publication, but I think that you have potential."
And that's a lot coming from Clarison. Yeah. When
So
you said that.
Clarison told sophomore Marleen Barr that she had potential. And I guess I wasn't upset that I was rejected, because I somehow knew that I had to do stuff like go to graduate school and get a PhD, and I was only a sophomore. So I think that sophomore me was happy to know that someone told me that I had potential. And I guess I heard that, and I took my little Norton anthology of American literature and brought it to the library of the campus. And I guess I went into the library to try to hunt cute college boys. And
Marleen, don't you
that's what I
think this
did.
shows, oh, I'm sorry, I'm cutting off the end of your words. I didn't mean to do that. But don't you think that this shows it's important which kind of personality some of these very prominent figures have? I'm sure in California there must be, I think he did mentor some people, Harlan Ellison, but maybe not, but I think he probably did too. We just don't know of them, or you'd have to read memoirs and things about him. But you see now the importance of those voices encouraging you. That was the same thing that happened with me and Isaac Asimov. And if people are all about themselves, then these younger people are nobodies. And I was in one one science fiction convention, very small in Wisconsin, and one of the women my age, and I knew her really well, I'm not going to name names, but we were critiquing her little short story, and I said something about the ending could be better. And she looked at me and she said, Gloria, who cares what you think? After all, you are just a nobody. And to say that in a circle of writers, it was, this is a person, a female who was known in that era for, just letting it fly, not quite as much as Harlan, but she said what she thought. And at that time, I was writing to Isaac Asimov, and I told him how humiliating it was to be singled out just because I had a critical remark about the ending of her story and told in front of all these people, who cares what you think? You are just a nobody. And he knew the person that did it too, because she's well known and she wasn't a bad person. She was just having an off bitchy moment at that moment. And he wrote back and he said, nobody can make you feel a nobody unless you let them.
Well, it's very important to mentor younger people because every young person is a nobody, and the younger people grow up and you don't know what 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 they will become. And when you were talking, I thought of something that happened in my life, that I have extensive international experience, and I had 3 Fulbrights, and I lived in Germanic countries for a total of like 5 years in my life. And I was a visiting professor at the University of Innsbruck, and I was thrown in with all the Austrians. And a young Austrian woman, when she was a college student, wrote me a letter, and I answered the letter, and she could not believe that a professor would answer her when she was a student. And she became an assistant professor at the University of Innsbruck when I was there, and I wasn't good at computer skills, and I had my own little place in the library to write, and outside of my favorite output, which I could look at, and I could not get my book, Feminist Fabulation, out of the computer. And she walked in and she got my book out of the computer. And if it were not for her, I don't think that Feminist Fabulation could ever be published. And the person that was the head of the department was a very elegant Austrian woman. And there was a my age Austrian woman, and there was the assistant professor. And these women were so elegant and so beyond me. And I named them, the department head, I named the Empress, the my age one, I named the Princess, and I named the assistant professor the Lady in Waiting. And the Empress, they all did a makeover of me, like with clothing and haircuts. I reverted to myself, but they kind of changed me into trying to be this elegant Austrian woman, and I did what they said, and I guess it was okay. And the Empress said, Marleen, I want you to come to the opera in Innsbruck with me, and I want you to meet my boyfriend, the Count. And I said, well, I never met a Count. And she said, no, he's very nice. You'll like him. So I go, I'm dressed up in my Austrian, God knows what, where I had the makeover, and in the lobby of the opera house. And she walks up to me and she goes, Frau Professor Dr. Barr, I'd like you to meet my boyfriend, the Count von Blancablanc von Blancablanc. And I couldn't believe it. And he takes my hand and he kisses my hand. And for me, like this New Yorker having this Count kiss my hand, I didn't know what to do, and I was plotting. And in a straight face, I said, how kind of you to let me come. Quoting My Fair Lady, and I lived through the opera, which I hated, and I went back to the department in Innsbruck, and I told this to the young woman who I called the Lady in Waiting. And we were she was very Americanized because she had a Fulbright to America. And we were like we were almost urinating. We were laughing so hard about me meeting the Count. And she now lives in Brooklyn, and she's friends with me. And I love having her as a friend. She's wonderful, and she has a daughter who's a freshman in college. And I said, well, why is it that you wanted to be friends with me, and how come this started? And she said, because when I was a college student, you took the time to write to me, and I could never get over that you, a professor, would write to a student. And And now I have this great friend in New York, and I have a great time hanging out with her, and it's wonderful. And if I was a snob and I said I'm not going to answer a student, I wouldn't have this friend, and I wouldn't have the anecdote of me having someone to come back to and say, you know, I met a count and I can't believe it. And my book would still be in the computer at the University of Innsbruck to this day. So I'm trying to say that it's important to treat everybody with respect. It's a fundamental part of humanity, and you certainly have to mentor you have to mentor students. And the cliche is what goes around comes around, and that's really true.
That's true. And I'm so glad you're kind of, we're getting to the end of my pointers and tips what to talk about. So do you have any other topics, or shall we leave it on that human note that it's very important how we treat other people? What is the old saying? Because if you mistreat them on the way up, they'll kick you on the way down too.
Right. I think that's a very nice way to end it, and I very much enjoyed speaking with you.
Well, okay, so we haven't really ended it though. We have all these very eminent people who are in our audience, and maybe one of them will, one or more will have some comments, or maybe they have either New York experiences or questions. How about it, folks? Any questions for Marleen? Any New York anecdotes or anecdotes from your own life that parallel hers?
Well, this is Joan Mendelson. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
You can.
Yes. Well, I must tell you, thank you. I appreciated your talk. It was lovely and whimsical, and including all of the other reality that underlies what you had to say. And I appreciated it.
Thank
It
you.
was delightful.
Thank you, Joan. Thank you.
Thank you.
I should say Joan has had her own share of these kinds of brushes with greatness, which she may or may not want to discuss. but some of us, you know, have known our own share. I see Joan Mendelson, if you want to talk about that in a minute. I see Joan Palo has her hand up. Joan?
Well, I'm not I don't know much about the science fiction world, and I'm impressed that there are science fiction scholars. I mean, I don't see why that shouldn't be like a major, you know, major field.
It is now. I was talking about the past. It is now. It, it, it's accepted now, and people, the scholars who came after me did not have to deal with what I dealt with. So it's much better now.
Thank you for being a trailblazer. How did you find humor? I saw some of the, I went to Wikipedia, and I saw that you'd written some short pieces that were sort of humorous. What kind of humor did you begin to initiate or invent in science fiction? The the thing, just that things are so different in that world, almost harbors humor in itself. But do you want to comment a little bit on humor in science fiction, or
Sure.
thank you.
I invented a subgenre called Trump punk, and I published 2 anthologies of fiction about Trump. When Trump Changed, the Feminist Science Fiction Justice League quashes the orange outrage, pussy grabber. And this former president, science fiction is retrospective, retro rocket, jettisons Trumpism. And if I wrote 2 humorous Trump punk short fiction anthologies about Trump, I must be very angry. And what I was trying to do in terms of humor was, I cannot equal this person, and I am not in any way in the same league with him, but in my own little way, with my limited talents, I'm trying to be like a baby boomer version of Mel Brooks. And Mel Brooks said that ridicule is a weapon. And Mel Brooks had the experience of liberating the concentration camps in World War II. And from that came came The Producers and Springtime for Hitler. And what Mel Brooks did in retribution for what he saw in the concentration camp, which I cannot imagine because I went to the concentration camp of Auschwitz in like the early 2000s, and I cannot imagine what it would be like to walk into it in the 1940s. He responded with humor. And Springtime for Hitler, it was amazingly effective. And what could I do to stand up to Trump? Well, I have a natural, innate Jewish humorous voice that just exudes out of me, which is also not scholarly, but that's the way it is. And I use my humor and my New York Jewish of the genre, much less talented, of Mel Brooks, to try to write these stories and use humor as a weapon in the way that he did. And I think I know that I'm up to volume 3. I hope I don't have to do volume 207 and enough already, but it just comes out of me, and I turn it into humor because I don't know what else to do.
I think that's often the way it is with humor. We call it Swiftian satire. You know that term, right, Marleen?
Yeah.
And Jonathan Swift was outraged at the willing eye aversion of the wealthy in Dublin to the plight of the tenant farmers, and he got madder and madder. Sort of following his trajectory like yours, and he couldn't get them to listen. He would preach from Trinity Cathedral, and he was the rector or whatever, and they would go ho hum, oh good, it's over, now we can leave. And so he kept it up, and you have to wonder, it does have an effect. Some people would say that humor doesn't change anything, but if you don't mind, this is a slight segue. Academics hate humor. Now, we haven't talked about that. You do not write humor in your academic studies, right? When you're doing let me just get to the end of the sentence here. That was another groundbreaking thing that you got into the PMLA, was you don't do wisecracks at the audience. Normally, they have what they call academic distance, academic register that you speak in, and it's very dry, and you might slip somebody's funny word in, but you put it in quotes. You distance yourself from that funny sentence. But wasn't that breaking all the rules when you made it funny?
Well, I always combined academic criticism with humor. That is just the way that I wrote. And I once had a conversation with my dissertation director, Norman Holland, and I said, Norm, this academic criticism is so dry. I think that it should be humorous, and I think it should be fun to read. And Norm said, I agree, Marleen, but you're the only person who can do that. And I think I'm still the only person who can naturally interject humor into scholarly discourse. And I have, if you look at my CV, all of my titles are really complex and really funny. And I'm coming back to Gunn because I came up with a really great Marleen title for our anthology. And Gunn looked at me and he goes, no, Marleen, I'm sorry, I can't do that. We must have a direct title. And the title came out of the book that I did with him, came out to be Reading Science Fiction. That was the title. And that I told you that like I would never count the gun. And I said, okay, Jim, Reading Science Fiction. But there's a Marleen title called Reading Science Fiction. That is not a Marleen title. And I always came up with these titles, and I always put humor into my criticism. And I'm having a revelation right here. Not only was I groundbreaking because I did science fiction, I was groundbreaking because I did humor and scholarship.
Mm-hmm.
Oh,
Yeah.
and people hated that.
I was going to say, I bet you got a ton of, what do they call it, blowback at conferences.
Yes. I just put out another anthology, and they took my introduction and chopped it down by 2/3.
And the one essay that you had in the Ray Bradbury book was one that one reviewer singled out as why it was an uneven collection. He said, if only they hadn't had this funny essay in there, you know. So you had one more slam from a reviewer of the Ray Bradbury, orbiting Ray
Well,
Bradbury's Mars, you know. They
well,
just,
it's still in there, so I'm glad.
it's still
but
in there, no.
but as of a month ago, people are still having fits about my humor. And it's still to this minute, I'm going, oh my God, I'm this age and I've done this much, and they're still trying to shut up my humor. They're
Well, you
wrong.
see, that's their, it's a mode and it's a hard one. The academic as as a very lofty role model for the community, looking down his nose, but very, very serious at the world is a, you know, it's a hard nut to crack. What can I say?
Well, some people like how I write with humor, and some people don't, and that's why they make jelly beans all different colors. And you can't make everybody happy all the time. And for those of them, for people who like it, I'm glad. And for those of people who don't like it, they could change the channel. But this is the way I write, and that's it. And it served me well. And Norman Holland said to me, this is what I took away from working with him. The most important thing is to write in your own voice. This is after all the years of knowing him and working with him, that is what I take away. Write in your own voice. And that's what I do. I write in my own voice, and a lot of people have published it. And again, okay, that's how I write.
I think we learned that in our little collection, Children of Steel, because there's been a lot of dismissive treatment of working class people, especially when they're from industrial towns. And often it's assumed that they can't write, they're not bright enough to write. They're steelworkers kids, what are they? You know, they're nobodies. So you do get various forms of this, and it's like a little salmon swimming upstream when you take on these assumptions and stereotypes, and you know, just the way things always have been. You have to create a new little niche, which, and yours was not little, yours was it was like a huge niche that other people could step into. It was great.
Thank you.
So I think with this, maybe any other observations or questions from our audience here? And I want Marleen to know that this will go out now. It will be uploaded to YouTube. And I hope all of you who came to this meeting will share it on your list, because she is a catalyst for change. And I will certainly put it on my Facebook and tell everybody, you know, it doesn't matter. They know that if they missed the live meeting, to be sure and catch it now on YouTube. So I will send you the link, Marleen, and to all the people who were here. And I'll put it out on Facebook, and you'll get many more views. So
Thank you.
yeah, well, anybody else, or I shall say, have a good rest of your morning, everyone.
Well, I enjoyed doing this. It was a pleasure to talk with you, Gloria, and I enjoyed interacting with the audience. Thank you all so much for this wonderful experience.
Okay,
Thank
well,
you.
yeah,
Thank you.
thank you so much, and have a great 2025, and I know it will be productive, Marleen. You are productive, so. Yeah,
I
have a good
try.
one. Okay, well, bye-bye, everybody. I'm gonna call it now and go on bravely into 2025.
Bye.
See you.
Happy New Year. Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye, Gloria.